welcome to Simpler Bible, a daily journey to biblical understanding. John chapter 2 is famous for recording for us the first miracle of Jesus, at least the first that was visible to anyone, right? So, because you could argue like his birth and some other things, but this is the one that's kind of counted as his first miracles. It's at the wedding of Cana. Begin with me in John chapter 2, verse 1. On the third day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus was also invited to the wedding along with his disciples. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." All right, I've mentioned this before. I want you to pay special attention to Jesus's language of "my hour has not yet come." So he's asking her like, why are you asking me to do something about the wine? It's not my time yet. It's not my hour yet. And we see in John 7 and in John 8 and in John 12 and John 27 and John 13 that Jesus uses this language of hour. And so, or the Bible uses this language of the hour of Jesus. And so there's a place where the people try to kill him, but it wasn't his hour to die. And so Jesus is progressively saying, it's not my hour, it's not my time. And then in John 12:27, he says, "Father, my heart is troubled. What should I say? Save me from this hour. No, it's for this reason that I've come to this hour." And then in John 13, knowing that his hour had come, this is where he washes the feet of the disciples. And so the ministry of Jesus is moving towards what hour? The hour of the cross, the time of the cross. So he says, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. So the purification rites of the Jews could be considered baptisms. It was different purification rites. If you go back into the book of Leviticus and you see that somebody had sinned, especially if somebody was like a leper and they would go outside the city for 7 days, they'd come back in, their skin would be examined. If they were getting better, they'd go back outside the city for another 7 days. They'd come back in. If they were clean, then they would shave all the hair from their body. They would bathe themselves, purification, and then they could go into the temple and present themselves to the priest as people who were clean. We also saw in the tabernacle and in the temple the wash basins. There were, I think, 10 wash basins in the tabernacle, each holding about 240, 250 gallons of water. There was the sea of bronze in Solomon's temple. There was a big thing that held, it's estimated between 12,000 and 18,000 gallons of water that the priests would purify themselves in before they did the work of the ministry. And so the purification rites of the Jews are stringent, and there are so many of them. And so what specific purification rites are these talking about? Is it talking about the purification rite that the woman undergoes after she's had her period? Or is this the purification of after someone's had a bodily discharge, or after a son was born, or after a daughter was born? There were so many purification rites. It is interesting to note, though, that these water jars were set aside for this purpose, okay? Holding 20 to 30 gallons each. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." They filled them up to the very brim, and he said, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast." So they took it. When the master of the feast tasted the water, now become wine, he did not know where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. The master of the feast called the bridegroom and said, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and then when the people have drunk freely, they give the poor wine, but you have kept the good wine until now." This is the first of his signs Jesus did at Cana in Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Although we know that belief in him is so-so, right? Because when he died, they weren't sure what to believe. When he was raised from the dead, they weren't sure what to believe. When he appeared in the upper room in their midst, it says they didn't believe in him. And when the women had testified that the tomb was empty, they didn't believe them. So take that with a grain of salt. Don't read this and automatically go, "Oh, this is when they became Christians," because they are not quite there yet. One other thing I want to point out here is it is interesting to me the number of people who say that Jesus and his disciples didn't drink wine. Jesus didn't advocate for wine. Jesus, literally, the first miracle he ever did was turn water into wine, literally. And it was the good wine. It wasn't poor wine. It wasn't weak wine. It was the good wine, whatever the heck that means. And so we have to quit taking our cultural preferences and biases and trappings and applying them to Jesus because we grew up in an alcoholic home, or we grew up in a culture that said you can't touch alcohol, it's sinful and shameful, and so now we have to try to justify away what Jesus did. Let the Bible be the Bible. Jesus turned this water into wine. Deal with it. It's there. All right. So Verse 12, after this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there for a few days. The Passover of the Jews was at hand. So this Passover is shortly after the beginning of Jesus' ministry. The Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons, and the money changers sitting there. And making a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen, and he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And he told those who sold the pigeons, "Take these things away, and do not make my Father's house a house of trade." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me," which is a quote from Psalm 69:9. So the Jews said to him, "What sign will you show us for doing these things?" So he's overturning the money tables. He says, "Don't do this in my Father's house." And they're like, "Do a sign to show us that you have the authority to do this." This is not any different than what we saw in John chapter 6. That is not how you spell John. There we go. John chapter 6, verse 2, and then verse 26 or something like that, where the people are following Jesus because he had done miracles. The next day they're following him because he had fed the 5,000. And then they're still going, "Well, give us a sign and then we'll believe." This is what they're always doing. It's why Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 that the Jews seek signs and the Greeks seek wisdom. There were always an excuse. People were like, no, I need more wisdom. No, I need another sign. And so they said, "What's the sign that you're going to do to be doing that you can do these things?" And listen to Jesus' answer in verse 19. Here's the sign he's going to do to prove he has authority here. Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jew says, "It took 46 years to build this temple, and you're going to raise it in 3 days?" But he was speaking about the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. And here's some parallel text for you in Mark 14, 15, Matthew 26, and Matthew 27. So when Jesus said, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up," this is the sign. This is how you'll know that I am who I say I am, by the resurrection of the dead, which is really interesting because Romans chapter 1 tells us that Jesus was a son of David according to genealogy, and he was proven to be the Son of God by his resurrection. And so the son of David through his genealogy, through his familial line, but proven to be the Son of God by his resurrection. And that's what he's saying. Destroy my body, destroy my temple, destroy this body, and in 3 days it'll be raised back to life. Then you'll know that I have the authority to say these things that I'm saying. Because what does he say? I'm going to get this wrong because I didn't look it up for you. John 10, maybe 17 or 18. He says, "I lay my body down and I take it up again." And so that's what he's going to do. He's going to lay his body down in service to the Lord, and then he's going to raise his body up again. And that's what's going to declare him in power to be the Son of God. Verse 23. Now, when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, many believed in his name. Again, those of us who grew up in and around church, what we heard was just believe in Jesus. And so for us, the idea of believing in Jesus is synonymous with becoming a Christian. You cannot read the Gospels necessarily that way, right? Because a lot of people at this point are going to believe in him, are going to follow him. And then what's going to happen in John 6? We already covered this a week or two ago. In John 6, when Jesus says, "Unless you eat my flesh and blood, you have no part with me." And what does it say? Many who believed in him ceased to follow him, ceased to be his disciples. So this isn't salvation. This is people who are believing something about Jesus. These are people who believe he's a good man, he's a good prophet, he's a good teacher, and they're believing things about him. We'll see this a little bit more when we get into John 8 in a couple of days. But many are believing in him, but there's something not quite right. They're believing that he's going to be an earthly king. They're believing that he's going to restore Israel to its kingly stature and a kind of a unified nation that hasn't existed since King Rehoboam, and the nation split to Israel and Judah, and they're believing that he's going to restore the glory that was there under King David. And so they're believing things about him, but they're still missing it. We saw just a couple of days ago how the disciples, those who were closest to him, those who followed him in his death and in his resurrection, that they struggled even to believe that he was who he says he was. So pay attention, verse 24 and 25, very important here. Let me read verse 23 again. Now, when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, many believed in his name when they saw the signs he was doing. But Jesus, on his part, did not entrust himself to them because he knew all people. He needed no one to bear witness about man, for he himself knew what was in man. So they believed in him, and yet it says that Jesus did not entrust himself to them. They're believing something about him, but Jesus is not revealing the fullness of who he is to them yet, because he knows the wickedness probably that is in their hearts. And so this is Jesus revealing himself at the wedding of Cana, turning water into wine, and good wine at that. And it's not his hour to die, and he's flipping over tables in the temple, and he is confronted by the people, and they're like, what sign are you going to do that proves that you have the authority to do this? And he says, look, kill me. Just kill me, and in 3 days, I'll be raised back to life. Destroy this temple, and in 3 days, I'll rebuild it. I'll come back to life, and that'll prove that I am who I say I am, that I have come from God. And of course, Paul bears that out for us in the book of Romans. And so that is John chapter 2. Thanks so much for joining us on that, and I will see you next time. Thank you so much for journeying with us today at Simpler Bible. Together, you and I have looked at another passage of Scripture and come to know the Bible a little bit better and enjoy God more fully. This video, along with all of our videos, can be found at simplerbible.com, where you can enjoy our Through the Bible in a Year course. You can also enjoy a wealth of resources, blog posts that take you a little bit deeper into the text, a Bible study format that you can use with your small groups or your family, and we're creating new content all the time, all with the commitment to help us be people who know and enjoy God more fully. Thank you so much for being part of it, and we can't wait to see you next time.